Hi, lovelies. Welcome to Love Our Planet. Miss Marcie, Canada's pinup girl here. I host and produce TV shows, podcasts, and fundraising calendars. You can find out more about me through the link to my website in the description below. But truthfully, I'm pretty naive about climate change, not gonna lie. But super excited to educate myself and dig deep on how to love our planet. I have my co-host here, Jenny Carver, with me. Tell the folks about yourself, Jenny.
I'm a mental health professional and activist turned into a committed climate activist. I'm also a pretty curious and deep learner, big on the learning curve. My MO right now is connecting with other people to do what we can about climate change individually, collectively, and through political action. I'm also really juiced about the intertwining of the climate crisis and mental health. So in this episode, we dig deep into understanding and naming the grief that we're experiencing in relation to the climate crisis. With our guest, we'll delve into the need to process these feelings as we move forward in our relationship with our planet, and as we imagine the possibilities for a better future and take action as we care for and love our planet.
So we have with us Ruby Randall. Ruby is a mental health therapist with a focus on grief. She has a personal interest in the intersection of grief and climate change. And I know Jenny and I both loved the quote and goal she has and said, and I'm going to quote her, to move us from a place of avoidance, denial, and apathy towards a space of possibility, hope, and action. So beautifully said. Let's dig deeper, Jenny.
Hi, Ruby.
Hi, Jenny.
Really interested to hear a bit about how your work relates to all these experiences folks are having around climate-related despair, anxiety, that whole eco-anxiety thing. Tell us a little bit about that.
My job as a grief therapist, obviously, like lots of people are confronted with their own mortality in kind of working through grief around somebody who has passed, who's really close to them. And I think for all of us, it's quite hard to be confronted with our own mortality and the thought of, the people we love dying, animals dying, the planet dying. These are, challenging emotions to move through. And I think in the West, in some ways, we're kind of like grief illiterate. We don't have a lot of built-in ritual around dying well. And a lot of us don't really know how to talk about death or be with death. I think anxiety is a really natural response in the face of this big existential challenge we're faced with, climate change, especially because we don't have a good understanding of the role grief plays in the climate crisis. I see a lot of anxiety in the folks that I work with after someone they love has passed. I think it kind of creates a sense of like groundlessness about their own inherent safety and the safety of the people they love. And we're living in this really kind of like tenuous spot with our planet, our home, where we feel constantly bombarded with messages about what's to come without a good sense of, how we're going to tackle climate change and if it's possible. Like, not so much do we know what to do to solve the climate crisis, but can we organize ourselves across difference enough to actually save our planet? So I think panic anxiety is a really reasonable response to such uncertainty, especially when the stakes are so high.
It's about the pain and the hurt around the planet and its beings dying. I mean, that's grief. If you love your people and your family and your trees, then if they're not well, that's grief, right? That's painful. That's hurt.
Yeah. I actually say that all the time when people are like, oh, this is such heavy work you do, like as a grief therapist. And I often say, like, right beside grief, like the other side of the coin is often love. So actually so much of my job is like bearing witness to the, like, this expansive love people have for the people who have died in their lives. So, yes, my job is about holding space for the deep sense of loss, but also I get to witness how big people's love is. Mm-hmm. And so I think that our love for the planet is so big that it's really actually hard for us to reconcile the grief because it's so big.
Are people feeling like they can't acknowledge and have those painful emotions recognized?
You mean around the climate crisis?
Yeah, thinking about the grief around climate and the hurt and pain around climate, or there's not a lot of conversations happening about that deep pain and grief, because people are kind of wanting to go, yes, well, let's get going, let's do something.
Yeah, I mean, I know you and I, Jenny, have talked about this before, and Britt Ray, in her book Generation Dread, which I would recommend folks read, talks about this idea of disenfranchised grief, which I think is kind of what you're pointing to, which we talk about in my work all the time. When somebody comes with grief that feels unnameable or unnamed, or isn't like recognized or openly acknowledged in society as like quote unquote real grief, it can be harder to move through unnamed grief because our feelings don't really get the validation that they need. So when we validate our emotions, we're essentially saying to ourselves, like, this makes sense, you make sense. That's really powerful because the parts of us that are holding this distress feel like they've gotten our attention. So they often turn down their volume once they feel like really heard. And this, as you can imagine, when the volume gets turned down, makes space for other emotions or new energy, because we're no longer expending all of our energy holding this distress, which is trying to get our attention. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think that the disenfranchised grief, it being unnamed, there not being spaces where we can say this is really terrifying, means that we're holding the anxiety, holding the grief, and, not, it doesn't feel generative. We're not able to like have the grief transform us or transform into some sort of movement or action. We feel kind of stuck in it.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Actually, I was just thinking about how the healing journey I've been on is very similar. Grieving my mother's death when I was 13, and I just grieved it finally as 41-year-old, really releasing it. And it makes me wonder how this could be very relatable to loving ourselves in response to loving our planet. So being able to really dig deep into our own traumas and our own abilities that way could actually, maybe, I'm just saying, I don't know, open up the ability for others then to love our planet and not have maybe that anxiety on top of other anxieties that are already there through our traumas. Does that make sense to you, Ruby?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I hear you saying is like in kind of working towards healing ourselves, we make space for, being able to like attune to what's happening in the planet. And we have space then to kind of like extend caring beyond ourselves. Like pain, anxiety, depression make us really self-focused and short-sighted because we're in pain.
Yes. Yeah. So I just know from my personal opinion, even personally, having now being able to do this podcast with Jenny, I have space now for you and for the planet and for others more so than I have in my 41 years. So it's really, I think that's something that maybe more talk could happen in that regards too, that we're not just then doing it selfishly for ourselves, but we're doing it for everyone around us, a planet, everyone, like my space for my 14-year-old, space for him. And, anyways, this is a beautiful conversation. I love that you are touching so much on this in your work, and so important.
And I'm interested in what you say about kind of getting stuck or immobilized in that, and also how we understand that, and then how we understand what you're saying about kind of that relief from that with the space for it. And I'm wondering how that kind of, my brain is going to the climate action stuff, of course. And I'm an optimist, right? So I'm always like, oh, just do this. And it's like, no, actually, there's a lot you have to do before you can take action, because you have to confront some of that pain, right? That's what you're saying.
I do know that there's a lack of spaces where we're even able to like name the pain around climate change, I think. So yeah, I think that sense of how do we validate that this is real and that it is like terrifying and devastating to fully understand that we're living on a dying planet, and to connect with our own sense of relationship to the planet, as a beginning.
Yeah, because one could get hijacked. One could get hijacked into the place of despair, right? And that has to happen certainly to own it and name it and experience it, but then you don't want to stay there. I mean, nobody wants to be there. And then also for the love of our planet, it's important not to stay there, right? Because we're all needed to come to this table and get this work done, right? So
yeah, I think a bit, and I know also Jenny, you and I have talked about this, but about this kind of like crisis of the imagination and grief's role in the imagination. And I think about when I start working with a client, it can be hard for them to imagine like a day where they won't feel overwhelmed by their grief because it's so intense, and a day, where they feel like they won't be in intense emotional pain. But in validating, giving space to process the grief, I think, and Marcie, you could probably even talk to this, you allow it to become a part of your story, yes, without getting stuck in it. Mm-hmm. And then, like I said before, it can become, and I see this with people, like generative in the way that is like a catalyst for growth, or illuminates what really matters to them, or like brings, into focus like a sense of humanity or shared humanity, and all of these things are generative. And I think that is obviously what we need moving forward, is a sense of like our energy being freed up so it's generative, as opposed to being kind of paralyzed in, as you said, despair, or this feeling like, we don't know where to go from here.
And it's interesting when you think about all the uncertainties, what you say about in a time of such uncertainty, how do you imagine the possibilities, and how do you imagine the future? Yeah. You kind of have to paint that picture for yourself, because it's hard to move towards something you don't know, right? So how does that work? The imagining part, when you don't know really, none of us really know what's going to happen, and we don't want to it's uncertain.
I just know that I'm curious about the role of the imagination in healing, period. Yeah. Like, I'm curious about like the role of the imagination in healing the body, and in healing our emotional body, and in healing the planet. So I think, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't know the answer to these questions. I'm like in the middle of...
Questions are good.
Yeah,
well, this is why I'm
in the middle of like having curiosities about these things without a sense of like, well, I think this is also telling. Like, I'm at the beginning of imagining what's possible, and I think this conversation is part of that. Mm-hmm. But it's like my imagination only goes so far, because I'm also bombarded with like a lot of pessimism and apathy around what's possible. So I think we're kind of like at this precipice where we're kind of being asked to imagine a different way collectively.
And it's interesting because we have to hold at the same time the grief that's real and the love that we feel and the possibility. Like those seem like they can't coexist, but that kind of toggling back and forth between them, that's kind of like, that's how we have to be able to do this, because we can't shut down the grief because it's not going to go away because we're in a real situation. And yet we also have to move into a place where our executive brains, I'm not a neuroscientist, but you got to get your executive brain working for you, not just your emotional brain working for you and working for us and for our earth, right?
Mm-hmm. So, well, just from my perspective on it, touching on my grief and my experience, now it's been almost 30 years, I guess, of grief holding me kind of in a space that, I guess it could have held me in different ways in my life. I was able to be a daydreamer. And now, mind you, all throughout my young years, I was always told, you're daydreaming, Marcie. What do you like, I always got in trouble for daydreaming in school and being an imaginative child. And that actually was my saving grace, I have to say. And I've always felt that. I've been journaling that for many years. And even this Miss Marcie, Canada's pinup girl, no, that came from an imaginative space in my mind. And so to be able to grow with that and go into that space, well, I had the grief still while I was holding it, and having it with me all my life, and had layers of other griefs. I mean, I could go on and on. We all have a life that has more grief on top of the one what's the biggest one in my life. And that is, again, what we can talk about as well, is there's so much grief, so many layers of grief in regards to the planet. But I think personally, from my perspective, the imagination is so important. And the fact that we have endless possibilities, we really do. Like, as human beings, we do, but let alone, looking at the planet, we are connected to the planet. We're the trees, we're the rain, we're the river, we're the stream. We're all connected. So the more that we can dive into our grief and our own individual grief, maybe is what I'm saying before. And I'm not an expert, but I think having more space once your grief is gone, we can work on the planet, which is so connected to us.
And like it's cracking that open so that you can be mobilized in your own, to do what's important for you.
Yeah.
I think, Ruby, you said something about doing things that have meaning, right? Like you can't give somebody a list and say, go and do this, right? You have to connect with whatever the work, we're talking about the internal work, but then the community, the collective, or the personal work to make a difference in the planet is another whole piece that you've got to be heart connected to too, right?
Yeah, and that's what I meant by the Miss Marcie thing for me. For the last 7 years, I've been able to connect to that. I mean, mind you, don't get me wrong, I've had passions all my life because I was an imaginative kid, but now it really became a dream in my mind. And the dream, I did not give up on the dream. I kept going, even when there was so much despair throughout the 7 years. And so that does give kind of, the same idea. If we have enough of a dream for our planet, for the world around us, the people even around us, the homeless, there's lots of things that are happening around us. But in our regards to the love of our planet, I feel like, catching on to that and having a passion, maybe it's even just the little things, getting a bag and picking up garbage every day. Maybe it's like that's one way, but I am the naive person in the group. I don't really know all the things that we can do, and I want to know more and more, but the little things. And so maybe it's part of that is the helping the grief. I mean, I guess is having that thing that does keep you going each day.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like kind of in this moment paralyzed by my own sense of like, okay, what do we do? Like I have that going on in my head where I'm like, I don't know either. Like I know the small kind of like tangible steps that make us all feel like, okay, we have a minute sense of control in a situation that feels so big. But I think, and I wonder how you could relate to this in terms of your own grief journey, Marcie. But my kind of like energy or attention right now is kind of focused on, or I guess I'm just trying to kind of synthesize and simplify my own big grief feelings about what's happening with the planet by just focusing on a relationship with the planet, like going to the water every morning and like really building a relationship so that, like I think about like if my friend was dying, I wouldn't leave them to die. I would care for them every day. I would care for them in like really meaningful ways if I, and so I think about that being like, I really think we're moved by relationships, like moved to action because of relationship, not because of ideas. And I think the problem with being like, do this, 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 and this is it kind of stays within that kind of space of this is an idea, and then we can separate ourselves from it. And it exists outside of us, but a relationship exists within us. It's about reciprocity. So it's like, okay, how do we build and cultivate and nurture a relationship with our planet so that the caring is, we can't help but give a shit.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I feel like that's actually like the grief that I'm going through right now, or that part of that grief for me is loving myself and actually caring for myself. So being really, and we could then, like you said, care for the planet in the same way. So for me, I go to the gym, I make sure there's just things that I've in the last 6 months have really like epically, I mean, I've always loved myself, but not to this extent because I have now room to love myself. And I guess also too is like more grieving is regards to like, what are emotions now? Now that I actually can feel, which is funny. I mean, not that I didn't feel, but it definitely, I've been in survival mode all my life. So now I can actually relax and receive and then actually listen and feel myself now. And that's a big one. So same with the planet,
So there is, I guess I'm thinking about the internal work that each of us needs to do to own and love our pain. I mean, that's a weird thing to say, but like you kind of have to be in it and love it and accept it, and it's going to be there, and you have to. I said something once about name it to tame it, or something like it. It's like that's there, and there's more. Like it's not like you're going to go through this linear process and then you come out the other end as some kind of climate guru activist, right? It's like all those things happen back and forth throughout our, challenging and loving lives, right? It's like it's a full project. Super interesting. Wow, that's such a good first conversation to have around
love our planet, for one, the love of so many different
love and caring, growing, helping each of us to get in touch with that relationship with our planet and to imagine what caring looks like. And I'm always a big believer in the kind of the collective on that, and sometimes having spaces and community connection around doing some of these things. For me, I know that becomes important because I feel like we're in this together, because we are, and that somehow helps too. Or do you have thoughts about the moving through and having all of these things at once, Ruby, and approaches that are helpful for people? Or like you're talking about being in it and having a relationship with the planet at the same time. Question is, I guess, any kind of words of wisdom around living with the despair and the hope and caring?
I mean, number one, I'm like in it, so I don't exactly feel like I have a sense of like I'm looking at it from a bird's eye view and I have this like earned wisdom around it.
Yeah.
Because I feel, I feel newly like energized and interested in climate grief because of my own big feelings around what's happening with our planet, and it feeling more closer than it ever has, which is a privileged position to be in. That climate change feels, all of a sudden like I'm seeing it, because in lots of other places of the world, they've had to reckon with climate disasters for a lot longer than we have in Canada. So, it feels new to me. So I don't feel like in a position to offer anybody like a ton of wisdom, but I know, like in working with clients who are in deep grief, like having like a space where the grief is allowed and validated, and also having connection across grief, which I think is kind of what you're naming with the community, like feeling connected to a community around these experiences of eco grief or eco anxiety. And, like things that I'm kind of doing, like on a very small scale, is just talking to people about their feelings about the climate crisis, and, reading different books by people who, are at this intersection of like mental health and climate change. Like I said, Generation Dread by Britt Ray has been really supportive and helpful for me. I know, Jen, you read it also.
Ooh, amazing book.
Yeah, it's so good. It's really, really worth a read. Yeah, I feel like maybe actually, Jenny, you could probably speak to more of those like actionable things, because I feel like you're kind of in that space more than I am, actually. So maybe I'll ask you the question.
Yeah, good. Bang it back at me. Yeah, you go, girl. Yeah, well, so I think my answer to that actually is changing, because I think I might have done the big list, and I think what I realize is that it's really about listening to what people are passionate about and helping them to find what the meaningful piece is for them personally, not just got to do these 10 things, check them off. It's more about, so what do you care about? Well, I actually care about the water. Okay, well, then there's things you can do there. I mean, I could rhyme some off, but I don't think that's helpful in a way. But if you care about, trees, if you care about people who are struggling with the climate justice issues, like that's such a huge piece. And I know, there's a deep concern about how disproportionate the impacts of the climate crisis are on, equity-seeking groups and folks who are marginalized or who happen to live over the fence from the plant or who had mercury in their fish or who are in a desertifying country. Like that's another whole conversation. So those folks don't have the resource. Likely they're in survival mode. They don't have the resource to do that work. So how can we become advocates in some of those spaces? So yeah, I think there are individual things in a household you can do. There are collective things you can do to regenerate your world around you and the beautiful places and spaces in our world. And then we got to get political, right? I did a mailing out to the big oil CEOs about, come on, we're on freaking fire, let's go. That's it. So, whatever those things are that charge, totally. Whatever your fire, it's about your fire, right? What's your fire about in this? Once you come through you don't have a lot of fire when you're in despair, but it's finding your fire, I guess, and looking at what you can do to, get those sparks around, right?
That's right.
And bottom line, it's all about the love.
It is all about
right?
the love. It is. That I do feel that's always been my thing, actually. It's always been something that's another little help or superpower of mine throughout my years of life is optimism and love. And not everyone has it, and not everyone, it's kind of can be exhausting, and it can be also like, oh my gosh, people stop being so lovely and optimistic. But I think it's so important. It's like, that's how you get through the day.
Well, and again, I'm thinking back to Britt Ray, and I'm right with you on Generation Dread. Britt Ray says, the principal emotion that can help us build a better world is love. And it's also grief. Like, you can't just go the la, 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 love, optimism. You've also got to go, no, actually, there's a lot of hurt here, right? And acknowledge that and have those things both in the space, right?
Beautifully said. Beautifully said.
Ruby, thanks so much.
Oh,
what a great, I really appreciate your perspective on this, and what a, I don't know, I found the heart's going here.
It is mine too. I'm so warm right now. Thank you so much for this lovely conversation and being vulnerable with it as well. Like it's like you said, like you go and you hang out in the planet and you have a relationship with it. So it is very vulnerable and touching and loving.
I love the relationship.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks, Ruby.
Well, thank you so much. This was so lovely, wasn't it, Jenny?
I'm all warm and thinking about so many sides of the coin that I want to explore more, and I have more questions about, which is always good. More questions,
more digging deep, right?
Yeah.
Well, stay tuned for our next episode, people. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
See you next time.
See ya.